All right, let's continue our series on making the case for Israel, the Jewish people's homeland. These are all review slides, which we do not need to spend one moment reviewing, because we've had a lot of reviews over the years. Sometimes we've had so much review that we haven't had a lot of content. But we talked last week about the first Roman Revolution in 66 to 73 AD. Began in Caesarea on the coast of the capital, where the prefect was, and resulted in the destruction of the temple, quite horrible, and the carting away of many, many Jewish people to slavery, the killing of many Jewish people. It is not a pretty picture. We also discussed, and the finale, the grand finale of this was the Zealots up on Masada. They were the last holdouts. That's why it went and didn't end in 70 AD. It ended 3 years later because there were a few holdouts. This was the last one, Masada, and the Jewish people killed themselves rather than be taken into slavery. So the result of that first Jewish revolt, in addition to the destruction of the temple, which is pretty much a big one, 1 million Jews killed, 100,000 enslaved and deported. Time goes by, majority obviously are still in Israel under Roman Revolution, but 6 decades later we have that second Roman Revolution that breaks out, the grandchildren more or less of the original revolutionaries. 132, it ends in 135, maybe 136 BC. This conflict was so egregious, resulted in wholesale Jewish casualties and enslavement and enforced deportation, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Remember what this one was about. Not just a revolution, but it was a revolution that was led by a false Messiah, a guy named by the name of Shimon ben Koseva, who was renamed by Rabbi Akiva, the big rabbi not only of the day, but for the next 2,000 years, he remains a huge figure in rabbinical understanding. But he identified Shimon ben Koseva as the Messiah, called him Shimon, Simon, the son of the star, based on the Balaam passage in Numbers. And many, many, many people, Jewish people, joined the revolution and fought under the flag, under the banner of this false Messiah. The relationship between Jewish believers and normal, regular, non-believing Jewish people was always fraught with a great deal of tension. As we know from the book of Acts, it becomes a big deal when the Jewish believers in that first revolution, the Lord told them, Jesus told them, Yeshua told them that when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, flee, because you know that temple is not long, will not be long standing. You're going to run. And so they do, largely, they flee across the Jordan River into Transjordan, what is today Jordan, a city called Pella, and a vibrant Jewish Christian community resides there. After the war is over, some of the Jewish people, the Jewish believers, return from across the Jordan, from Pella and various other cities in the Decapolis. They come and they resettle back into Israel. But because they did not fight in that first revolution, they are not looked at with any great respect or communion. Not exactly mishpucha if you didn't fight the revolution. Well, things are forever set. If there was ever any love or any hope of any kind of reconciliation between the Jewish believing community, those who followed Yeshua, Jesus, and those who did not, it is forever severed with this particular second revolution, because if the Jewish people fled when, the Jewish believers fled when Rome surrounded the temple, surrounded Jerusalem, then and how were they not going to fight under the banner of a false Messiah? So they are viewed on so many levels. The Jewish people, from that point on, viewed Jewish believers like myself as traitors. Again, on so many levels: theological level, cultural level, social level, political levels. So that was the final straw between the two communities, and from that point on, there was strong separation between the church and the Jewish community. But again, this is a letter from Simon Bar Kokhba. You can actually see, it's really interesting because these letters, obviously, these are 2,000-year-old letters. And you can go to the Israel Museum, you can go to the Dead Sea Scrolls Museum, you can see letters to and from Bar Kokhba, from his lieutenants, from his soldiers, from merchants in the day, mentioning the war. It's coins. In fact, there was just an article that was published recently, and I meant to bring it in, but with elections, it slipped my mind. They found another set of coins, I believe, with Bar Kokhba mentioned, the Bar Kokhba revolt mentioned. I have to read the article. I was just reading the headline. Let me not give you more and get ahead of my skis, get in front of my skis on this, because I haven't read the article, but we're still finding things to confirm that there was indeed an individual named Bar Kokhba who people believed was the Messiah, who led this revolution. Again, he lost the revolution. The revolution was lost. Bar Kokhba was killed in battle. Akiva, the rabbi who identified him as the Messiah, he was executed by the Romans. He's still, again, though revered. Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina. Jewish residents are exiled from Jerusalem. They were allowed, prior to that, they were still allowed to stay within the city. Now they are exiled from the holy city, and they are redistributed elsewhere in the land of Israel. Judea was merged by the Romans with its neighboring province and renamed as one giant province: Syria, which was the northern portion, and Palestina. Philistina, this is named after the ancient archetypical enemies of the Jewish people, the Philistines, which, of course, as you know, were non-existent by this time. The Philistines were not Arabs, they were not Canaanites, they were not indigenous to the land. We actually have, I say we, archaeologists, scientists actually have found Philistine burial sites, have identified or examined the DNA, compared the DNA between Canaanites and Philistines, and modern day, of course, quote-unquote descendants. The modern-day people living, the Palestinians, have nothing to do, no relationship whatsoever. The Philistines were sea people. They came from Cyprus and Crete and perhaps a portion of seafaring Greece, and came over, hopped right across the Mediterranean Sea and settled along the coastline of Israel, and were the major thorn in the sides of the Jewish people from the time of the Judges all the way through the time of the kings. They are eventually wiped out by the Babylonians when they come and conquer everything in 605. So the Philistines wind up in the dustbin of history, but their fame lives on. And so this region, this province, is now known as Palestina, or more formally, Syria, Palestina. This is meant to be a humiliating reference and a continual reminder to the Jewish people of their disgrace and their defeat. So more or less from 135 or 136 to 1948, the name of the ancient Jewish homeland, again, with certain various different intermissions and interruptions, was known as Palestine. Palestine was the name of the ancient Jewish homeland. Now, as I mentioned last week, with the Jewish people exiled from Jerusalem, with the Romans literally removing, there's no Jewish king, there's no Herod left, there's no Jewish king. It's completely administered by the Roman Empire, and this marks the end of the period of time from Joshua all the way through to this moment when the Jewish people had the Jewish nation had their existence. And it begins an 18-century-long period when the territory that was called by Rome and by various other conquerors over the years was known as Palestine. It simply became a subordinate province. It's a tiny backwater province that was subject to the rule of a succession of several world empires. Now, what happens now with Israel in this historic period, in the historical record? What happens, let's not get there yet, is that the center of gravity of the Jewish population shifts from Judea to the diaspora. Remember that even though the majority of the Jewish people lived outside of the land of Israel during the time of the Gospels, the time of Acts, they lived outside, like maybe 5 million to 3 million, something like roughly. We don't know. We're guessing. Okay, that's a historical guess. But nonetheless, because of the temple, the Jewish people in the diaspora understood that they were responsible to, now whether they did in reality or not, but they understood they were responsible to return to the central location of worship, which was the temple in Jerusalem 3 times a year. Now, very few of them probably made it 3 times a year from outside of Israel. Maybe they made it 1 time a year. Maybe they stayed for the 50-day period between Passover and Pentecost. But nonetheless, maybe they just came in the fall. Nonetheless, they had a reason and a tie to return on the regular, the semi-regular, to the Jewish homeland. But now, the numbers are vastly in favor of the Jewish population in the diaspora outside of the land. And there is no longer a temple to return to. As a matter of fact, Jews aren't allowed in the city of Jerusalem at all. But this is where most of our education has failed us. Because what we fail to remember and to understand, or maybe even to have learned, is that a substantial Jewish population in various centers, geographic centers, remained throughout Palestine, And in fact, the Jewish presence retained majority status in the land, i.e., more Jews than Romans or Byzantines or Arabs, whatever, okay, for centuries. In certain regions, like the north of Israel, the area of the Galilee, where Jesus came from and where his initial headquarters was. Well, the Galilee served as the initial nucleus of Jerusalem's, or Judaism's rather, theological development. Remember, the question has got to be answered if you're a Jew living in the time after the temple is destroyed. You've had 2 revolutions. Now the question is, how does Judaism continue? How does it not only continue, but how does it thrive in a world in which the temple no longer exists? Now, this was something that the Jewish people first faced for 7 decades, more or less, with the Babylonian exile. But that was truly a very limited period of time, and God gave them, through Jeremiah, the specific number of years that they would be in exile, 70 years. So they knew that when they were exiled to Babylon and to the neighboring communities, they understood only going to be for 70 years. We have to put a Band-Aid on this problem. We have to come up with a temporary solution of how to continue being Jews outside of a temple. So now, however, they are without a temple perhaps indefinitely. Who knows how long it's going to be? It was 60 years between revolutions, and the temple is farther from being built than it ever was. And it doesn't look like under Rome they're going to be able to build anytime soon. So the Jewish people, many again who had been exiled from Jerusalem, sent up to Galilee. If you've been to Jerusalem, one of the centers of Jewish philosophy and teaching and thought is that area of Tiberias, okay, right where a lot of the hotels are and where the boats, ships, the Jesus boat sails out of. But nonetheless, this is where the rabbis are hanging out, roughly in that area. And it becomes a center of Jewish thought and Jewish development during that time. For 1,800 years, the region of Palestine was never absent a significant Jewish population. Again, they were majority after the Roman Revolution, but over time, the communities diminish, but they do not disappear. They become a significant minority population. Now, we get to the Byzantine era. Now, I don't know if you know the difference between the Roman era from the Byzantine era. Basically, what happened was Rome got too large and was difficult to administer because there was a western portion, eastern portion, and what they wound up doing was actually creating a western Caesar and an eastern Caesar to administer this very large population. And then over time, the Visigoths gobbled up the West, and the Western Roman Empire really ceased to be by about, give or take, 400. With all my respect to the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, I don't remember exactly the year. Is it 425? Is it 400? I don't know. Bottom line is that marks the official beginning of the Byzantine era, when just the Eastern Roman Empire continues being ruled from Constantinople, which, by the way, is now Istanbul. But Constantinople is the center, and so this is called the Byzantine era. And 300 to 600 A.D., the Byzantines are in charge, so the Eastern Romans, in other words. And let's see, by the middle of the 4th century, that's the 300s, the Jewish people are allowed to return to Jerusalem. Aelia Capitolina is renamed again back to its name Jerusalem, and thereafter it's going to retain its name Jerusalem forevermore. And they are given permission by the Byzantines to move back into Jerusalem. But nonetheless, they're scattered around various different communities. So, the Byzantine era, this is the administration of the Byzantine era, and you can see they broke this area into different provinces for administration. There was Syria up at the top, Palestine down at the bottom, Arabia, they call this little area Arabia right there, Phoenicia. Very interesting. Ultimately, who cares, right? Just the Jewish people were there. And again, another way of looking at the Byzantine diocese, the way they carved up Palestine. So Syria up on the top, Palestina in the middle. And here you can see there's Palestine 1 and Palestine 2. They have various different provinces that they've carved this in, retaining the name Palestina. Now, 600, along comes Islam. Along comes the followers of Muhammad. This is post-Muhammad, but nonetheless, by the 7th century, 636, there's the Muslim conquest, and under Islam, substantial numbers of Jewish people were subjugated, but while they were subjugated as second-class citizens under Muslim rule, they nonetheless remained protected within the promised land. Now, the only downside of that was for the Jewish people remaining in the land was the imposition of Islam's very humiliating and restrictive dhimmi system. Not dummy system, dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. That means, so if you are living in an Islamic-controlled area or country or province, Islam must always be supreme. And so if you're not Islam, if you're Jewish, for example, you're okay as long as you participate in the system, which means you understand you have second-class status and you pay the dhimmi tax. You can't hold office. There's lots of things you can't do because you're a second-class citizen. But you are under the protection of Islam. Now, it's arguable that the Jewish people living in the land of Palestine, who were forced to endure the oppression and of dhimmi status, of second-class status under Islam, I could make the case that they were a lot better off than their brethren who were dispersed throughout Christendom. At that time, the Muslims did indeed treat the Jewish people better, as long as they participated, better than the Christians did, because there was no way that the Christians would accept Jewish people, because theologically, Christendom at that point was teaching that the church was the new Israel, the superior Israel, and it was really truly an affront to not only the church, to the papacy, and to God himself for these stubborn Jews to continue to exist, having been replaced by the church. So, for the crime of being Jewish communities outside of Palestine were regularly subjected to intensive hours of persecution, including capricious torture, massacre, an exile. But as you can see, in 1096, the period of Muslim control, and by the way, during Muslim control, this is when they built the Dome of the Rock, and next door, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Why did they build it where they built it? Because that was the location of the Jewish temple. And so the church, which theologically was teaching, hey, we're superior, the church which was teaching that they have replaced Israel, had its own way of dealing with superior, inferior, hey, you guys have no reason to exist anymore, we've taken your place. Whereas the Muslims, their philosophy was, they were content to simply show and demonstrate their superiority. So they're not replacing the Jews, they're not the new Jews, no, but they're better than the Jews, and they demonstrate that by building in the location where the Jewish temple was. We have supplanted the Jewish people. We have demonstrated our superiority. And that lasts until 1095, 1096, when the Crusades come to town, which was quite a show, but we're going to have to wait until next week to unveil that interesting show. Why are we going through this history? Why? Because it's important not only for a historical perspective, because we are still living in a world where the repercussions of what happened 2,000 years ago and every year between then and now still echoes, and it's in the news every day. And if you're going to be informed, more informed than, let's say, a student going to Harvard, which is not hard to be. But I was going to say, with all my respect to Harvard, no, I have no respect anymore for our Ivy system, for our college system, our university system, because they're teaching falsehood. I'm teaching you truth that is easily checked in the history books. You don't have to believe me. Take what I say, fact check it, step by step. Nothing I say can't be backed up multiple ways from Sunday. But you need to have this perspective, because the Jewish people are the apple of God's eye. And watching how it is that against all odds, we don't disappear into the dustbin of history, as have the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Ottomans, and a variety of names that you don't even, the Mamelukes, the Papalukes, the Babylukes, all the empires that have risen and fallen, the Byzantines. Who cares about the Byzantines today, except if you're studying art, right? Studying iconography, Byzantines. But the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, we're still here. Now, for that, you not only need to study history, but you need to have the perspective of understanding what the Bible says. And that God is not through with the Jewish people. It is through the Jewish people that the covenants have come. It is through the Jewish people that the Word of God has come. It is through the Jewish people that the prophecies have come. It is through the Jewish people that promises have come. It is through the Jewish people that our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, has come. So we all have a vested interest in understanding and having this perspective, in seeing the faithfulness of God. Some would rather perhaps, can you just preach the gospel for us, please? If you just want the gospel, I can show it to you, Ephesians 2. For you have been saved by God's grace through faith, plus nothing plus bupkis. Jesus died for our sins to reconcile ourselves to the Father so that we can have a relationship with him. All right, great. But there's a whole lot more to our understanding of what the Bible is teaching than just the basic gospel. We have to understand the faithfulness of God. And so we continue next week by getting in and seeing what happened to Palestine, what happened to the Jewish people during the Crusades, and then what happened after the Crusades. Anything of note? What connects us between the Crusaders and the Zionists establishing the state of Israel? Well, again, had to keep you in suspense. We'll figure this out in the weeks to come. All right, let's stand up for the Aaronic benediction.